Well, hey, Merry Christmas. How are you guys? Good? I got nothing. You good? We're good? We're good? Okay, we're good. Man, it's good to see. That's what I'm looking for right there. Okay. Hey, I'm glad you're here tonight. Welcome to First Christian. So glad that you're here to celebrate Christmas with us. It's been a great day. So you caught the last service. We're all tired, but we've worked out all the kinks by now. So you got the good one. So good job waiting for the end. That was smart. Hey, listen, I'm not gonna spend a whole lot of time unpacking the Christmas story for you, okay? Because you've heard it before. You know the story. I'll just give you the bullet points, just a quick version, all right? One night, an angel shows up in the living room of a teenage girl and says, "You're gonna have a baby." And she says, "No, that's not possible. See, I know where babies come from. You got the wrong house. It couldn't be me. Not possible," right? And the angel says, "No, you don't understand. This isn't a normal baby. Mary, God has chosen you to be the mother of his son." Imagine what she must have been thinking as she's trying to just make some sense out of this, right? Thankfully, she had more faith than I think I would have had, probably more than some of you would have had. Thankfully, Joseph did too, because she had to try to explain to her fiance, "I'm gonna have a baby, but I promise it's not some other guy's, it's God's. I swear God did it," right? But he had faith too. Okay, so fast forward with me a few months. Mary and Joseph are on a 100-mile journey from their hometown in Nazareth to Joseph's family's hometown in Bethlehem, which was about 100 miles for them to travel. And ladies, if you've had kids, here's the full context, right? Like, she's gonna have this baby any day, and she's traveling 100 miles on the back of a donkey. Does that sound fun to anybody? But they make the trip. They get all the way to Bethlehem. They're rolling into town, and I have to think Mary's going, finally, right? Finally, we're here. And then sure enough, you know what happens next. They get to the inn, there's no room. But the innkeeper says, "Yeah, but we've got a spot. It's behind the house. It's kind of in this cave. There are animals all around. It's not pretty, but if you need a place to stay, it's all yours." And so you know what they did? They took him up on it. They went and they settled in for the night in a stable surrounded by animals. And it was there in that place where God put on flesh and stepped into our world. Now, you've heard this before, okay? But tonight, I want to introduce you to some people in the story that we talk about them almost every time we tell the story. We just don't probably think about them a whole lot, but I think they're the people that we probably relate to the most. At least I do. We relate to these people so much in the story, and I think as we tell their story, you'll understand why the Christmas story has the power to change your life. Maybe for the first time, maybe it's changed your life many times over and it'll just happen again. I want to tell you their story, but before I get there, I need to back way up. Let me go all the way back to the beginning, literally the beginning, okay? There are 4 gospels in the Bible: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 4 books that tell us the story of Jesus and his life on earth with us. Matthew's the first one. It was written by Matthew. He was a Jewish man and he wrote to a Jewish audience. And you need to know that because it explains why he starts his book the way he does. See, to Jewish people, family history, lineage, genealogy is very, very important. And so Matthew starts his book out, and it just makes sense when you understand that before he gets to the story of Jesus being born, he has to tell us kind of where he came from. And so Matthew writes this genealogy. It's 42 generations from Abraham all the way to Jesus. And this family line, this genealogy is full of a bunch of incredible people. I mean, you've got kings and commoners, you've got Israelites and foreigners, you've got prophets and sinners. And it's a beautiful picture of what the family of God really is made up of. But you know, Matthew does something weird, okay? As you read through this genealogy, he does something confusing. And that is, he includes some people. He goes out of his way even to include some people in Jesus' family line that don't make any sense to include. Specifically, he includes 4 people I want to just highlight for you tonight, all right? 4 women, which was unusual enough because in traditional Jewish genealogies, you typically just included the men. You didn't usually mention the women, but Matthew goes out of his way to mention these 4 women. And when you know their stories, you understand why it's more than unusual. It was really unthinkable. It was weird that he would include these. And if you or I were writing this genealogy, we probably would have left them out. But Matthew makes sure to include them. It's these women, okay? First he mentions a woman named Tamar. And I'm not even gonna tell you her story because it's too PG-13 to get into on Christmas Eve at church. We're here to feel good, So I'm not gonna tell you her story. We got kids in the room, but you can read it later. Let's just say, just take my word for it. It's a story you would have left out. Okay, he mentions her though, and then he mentions this lady named Rahab, who was a Canaanite woman, which meant she wasn't from God's people, the Israelites. She was a foreigner, she was from a pagan people, and she was a prostitute. Kids, ask your parents about that later, okay? We would have left her out. Matthew includes her. He goes out of his way to include her in the story. And then he comes to Ruth, who had a really, really cool story. But the thing about Ruth was she was a Moabite, which was also not from the Israelite people. She was a foreigner. And if the men in her story, the Israelite men in her story would have listened to what God told them to do, they would have never even met Ruth. She would have never met her husband. She'd have never ended up in Jesus' family line. And so it's just interesting that Matthew goes out of his way to include Ruth, right? But then he gets to the fourth woman in the story, and this is the really crazy one. He doesn't even name her. He just refers to her as Solomon's mother, who had been Uriah's wife. Now, Uriah, we know her as Bathsheba. Maybe you've heard this story before. King David is out on the balcony of his palace one day. He's looking out over the city, and he sees this woman on a rooftop, and he thinks she looks good. And so he calls for her to come to the palace, and one thing leads to another. He makes some really big mistakes, some really foolish mistakes, and she ends up pregnant with his child. Now, the problem is she was married, and she was married to a general in his army, but more than that, to one of his closest friends. So to try to cover up for his mistake, he goes through several attempts, nothing works out. And finally, he calls her husband, Uriah, into the palace, and he hands him an envelope, and he says, Uriah, take this out to the commanders out in the field of battle and give them this message, right? Uriah has no idea what's in the envelope, but it's a message from the king to the commanders. And basically what it says is, hey, send Uriah out to the front lines of battle, and when the enemy gets there, you all back up. And essentially what David did is he sentenced Uriah to death to cover up for his own mistakes. Messy, messy story, huge scandal. And Matthew goes out of his way to include this in Jesus' family tree. Weird, right? And it's it gets even weirder when you understand that David had other kids other than the kids he had with Bathsheba, at least 19 legitimate kids that we know of. But Matthew goes out of his way to emphasize that Jesus came through the family line of a child who was born as a result of a couple from a scandal. It's like a king and the widow of a murdered general. And this is where Jesus comes from. Why would Matthew do this? This is what I have to wonder. Why would Matthew go out of his way to emphasize that these were the people in Jesus' family history? It's like he wants us to know, but you know what? He does want you to know. Let me tell you why this is such a big deal to Matthew. It's not just that these were messy people with messy stories that, became some crazy story of how good God is. It's that these were Matthew's people. See, Matthew wasn't just a Jewish man. He was also a tax collector. And in Jesus' day, if you were a tax collector, you were the worst of the worst. You were a traitor to your people. You had betrayed the Jewish people and gone to work for Rome. They hated you. You were an outcast. If somebody in your family became a tax collector, you cut them off. They didn't get the invite to Christmas dinner, okay? More than that, it's like you disown them completely. They're out of the family. And so Matthew reaches a point in his life where he's just accepted the fact that he's going to be an outcast forever until one day Jesus shows up at Matthew's tax collector booth and he says, hey, Matthew, come with me, follow me. And nobody like Jesus had ever asked somebody like Matthew to do something like that before. And it changed Matthew's whole life. And so he tells us these stories of these women, I think, because it's his story. These stories of messy people, messy stories. He was a messy person with a messy story. And here's the point, okay? He wants to send a message down through the generations, I think, to you and me. If Matthew were here tonight, I think what he would say to you and me would be the same message he was trying to communicate to the people that were reading his message for the very first time 2,000 years ago. And the message is this. It's that Jesus accepts those others reject. He's a friend of the outcast. And I want to introduce you to some of those people tonight that we meet in Luke chapter 2, the version of the Christmas story that we're most familiar with. This is how Luke starts this passage in verse 8. He says, that night there were shepherds staying in the fields nearby, guarding their flocks of sheep. This is happening in a field called Bet Sahor. It means shepherd's field. Makes sense, right? It's a field right outside the little town of Bethlehem, and Bethlehem was about 5 miles southwest of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the center of the Jewish religion. It's where the temple was located. It's where the people would go to worship and to sacrifice. And specifically in Jerusalem, 2 times a day, if you look at Numbers 28 in the Old Testament, they sacrificed a lamb twice a day. The Jewish day started at 6 a.m., okay? So they would sacrifice one lamb every morning in the 3rd hour, which was 9 a.m., and they'd sacrifice a lamb every afternoon at the 9th hour, which was 3 p.m. And you need to remember that for later, okay? 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. They'd sacrifice these lambs twice a day, these lambs that were raised in shepherd's field right outside of Bethlehem. And these weren't any lambs. They were perfect, spotless, no blemish, no injury, no problems with these lambs at all. If there was anything wrong with them, they couldn't be taken to the temple and sacrificed. They weren't worthy. Okay? And these sheep were coming from these flocks that were raised by these shepherds, but they belonged to rich people. And these rich people got rich by selling these sheep to people to sacrifice in the temple, but they would never degrade themselves to the lowest class job in all of Israel at the time. And so what they would do is they would hire these other people, pay them very, very little to take care of the flocks out in the field. And these people were the shepherds. But just because of what they did, they spent all their time in the fields with these dirty, stinky, nasty animals. And just because of the life that they lived, the living that they made, they were unclean. What that meant was they were unworthy and unwelcome to go into the temple to worship the God that they were raising sheep to be sacrificed to. And so for their lives, their entire lives, they just felt like outcasts. They felt cast off. They felt like throwaway people. Which is what makes what happens next in the story so much better, okay? Here's Luke 2, verse 9. Luke continues, "Suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared among them, and the radiance of the Lord's glory surrounded them. And they were terrified," which makes sense, right? You or I would be terrified. You're out in the field, middle of the night, it's dark out there. All of a sudden the sky rips open, it's full of angels, and they're shouting and singing, and there's this crazy light, right? Like you'd be freaked out, I'd be freaked out. But the first thing the angels say is, "Don't be afraid." And then he goes on, he says, "I bring you, shepherds, you, good news that will bring great joy to all people. The Savior, yes, the Messiah, the Lord, has been born today in Bethlehem, the city of David." So, man, the skies rip open. The angels give the shepherds this message. Good news for great joy. For who? Come on. Yeah. All people, right? All people. But listen, put yourself in the shepherd's shoes, because there's never been good news like this for them. Anytime something like this happens, it's good news. It's for everybody else, not for them. And so I just have to imagine that the shepherds are in the fields hearing this, and they're going, do you think maybe this time, maybe this could be good news for me too? The angel assures them that it is. It's good news for all people. Have you ever had somebody come to you and say they have good news, but maybe you're in a bad place in your life, or maybe you're just having a bad day or whatever, but somebody says they have good news and you instantly think, yeah, good news for you, not for me. And you just kind of go negative like that. Can I just tell you, I think that happens like every Sunday in rooms like this one. Somebody like me gets up on a stage like this and says that they have good news, but I know every time that there's somebody sitting where you're sitting who thinks, yeah, maybe this is good news for somebody, but it's not good news for me. Maybe this is good news for him, or maybe good news for her, maybe good news for their marriage, maybe good news for his addiction, or maybe good news for her cancer, but it's not good news for me, not with what I'm going through, not with the mistakes I've made, not with the life I've lived, not with what's in my past. This might be good news for somebody, but it couldn't possibly be good news for me. Well, the angel said today in the town of Bethlehem, a Savior has been born, but not just been born. This angel tells the shepherds, the Savior's been born to you. And he's Christ the Lord. And the shepherds don't know what to do with this, guys. They don't know how to make sense out of this, okay? Nobody's ever given them this kind of news before. And so they're trying to process this, and they just don't know how to add it up. Now, this is big because all month long here at First Christian, we've been talking about this. Every Sunday throughout the month of December, we've had this sermon series called Reframing Jesus. And the whole point is this, is that the people in Jesus' day have been waiting for centuries and centuries for God to send this Messiah. And in that time where they were waiting, they'd cooked up all these ideas of who they thought the Messiah was gonna be. And then when Jesus showed up and claimed to be the Messiah, but he was nothing like what they expected, they didn't know how to process that. See, they thought he'd be a military general or leader who would raise up this army and overthrow Rome and deliver the Jewish people from oppression. Or they thought he'd be born in a palace, he'd be born royalty, and he would sit on the throne and he'd rule the world, but he'd rule fairly and justly, and he'd be good to the people, to God's people. And when Jesus was born in a manger, in a stable, and he wasn't royalty, and he chose to hang out with not elite people, not wealthy people, not influential people, not royal people, but he hung out with commoners and outcasts and sick people and sinners and tax collectors and broken people and dirty people. He hung out with people who were nothing like the religious people. They didn't know how to handle him. And so as a result, they missed him. And what we've said all month long is, I don't want you to miss Jesus. And I know that some of you have an idea of who you think Jesus is. And hopefully you find out, for some of you, that he's not what you think, because maybe you think that he's not interested in a person like you. Maybe you think that your life, you're too far gone. You've got too many mistakes in your past. There's too much of a mess in your present. God couldn't possibly be interested in a person like you. As you find out that he's different than what you think, that can create a gap. And I don't want you to miss Jesus. There are two things that jump out to me from this story as I read about the shepherds. The first one is, these religious people all through Jesus' life struggled with how to make sense out of this guy. Like, he chose to hang out with people that nobody should want to hang out with. And he chose to do that instead of hanging out with them. And anytime they would ask him why he did that, why he chose to hang out with like the throwaway people, his answer was always something like, they're why I'm here. They're why I came. They're why I was born. They're why I'm here, right? And they didn't like that. And I think the message in there for anybody who would consider themselves a person of faith, a religious person, whatever we call ourselves, is this. If we ever start to gatekeep Jesus and think that he came for us, but not for somebody who thinks differently or acts differently or behaves differently or believes differently than we do, man, Jesus came for all people and he welcomes everybody. Now, he loves us too much to leave us the way we are when he finds us, but man, he doesn't turn anybody away. And if any of us ever start to gatekeep Jesus, I have to think if he walked in the door, he would have a very different message for us. He would say, you have this very backwards. Which brings me to the other thing that I think about every time I read the shepherd's story, and it's this. And I think this is maybe the word for some of you here tonight. It's that if you feel like one of those people who doesn't fit, doesn't belong, maybe you're here tonight because it's Christmas Eve and you go to church on Christmas Eve, but you don't go any other time because this just doesn't feel like a place for somebody like you. You feel like you wouldn't be welcomed or wanted. You think that this is a thing for people who have it all together, or this is a thing for people who can quote the Bible. This is a thing for people whose lives are neat and tidy and in order, and you wouldn't belong here. Then what Jesus would say to you, and what I want you to know tonight, is that every single thing he did in living and in dying and in living again was to prove that that's not true. It was to prove that he wants you and he welcomes you and you belong. You have a place in the family of God. No matter how messy you are, no matter how messy your story is, he wants you and he welcomes you. And he welcomes you with the same simple invitation that he offered to people 2,000 years ago who were the least of his day. He says the same thing to us. We find this invitation in Matthew chapter 11 when Jesus says, come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I'll give you rest. Let me tell you who he's talking to. The word for weary, when he talks about this in this verse, the word for weary is the Greek word kopiao, which means to grow weary or tired or exhausted with toil or burdens or grief. And so what that means tonight is if you're mentally tired, or if you're emotionally worn out, or you're physically or spiritually exhausted, he's talking to you. If you've been in a battle with your body over your health, if there's conflict in your family and it's just got you at the end of your rope, you're worn out with it, you're weary. Maybe it's in your career Or maybe it's at school with a professor. Or maybe you set out to study something and now you're rethinking that, and just the idea of shifting gears at this point, changing majors, whatever, it's got you overwhelmed and you're worn out with that, you're weary, right? Maybe you're afraid of something. Maybe there's a situation in your life right now that has you fearful. Maybe you're waiting on a doctor to call with results for a test and you're afraid you know what he's gonna have to say. Or maybe you're lonely tonight. And maybe some of you are lonely tonight for the first time because somebody who was at your Christmas dinner table last year won't be there this year. Whatever it is, if there's something in your life that has you weary tonight, then this invitation from Jesus is for you. And then there are people who carry heavy burdens, and that's a different Greek word. That word is fortizo, and that word basically talks about somebody who puts something on you. So what that would mean is, if you've been betrayed by somebody, if you've been gossiped about, if you've been stabbed in the back, if you've been neglected, if you've been abandoned, maybe you made a mistake and you've asked the person that you hurt for forgiveness, and not only will they not forgive you, but they keep beating you up with that thing, dragging you through what you did, reminding you of your mistake, reminding you of your failure, whatever it is. If there is something that somebody has done to you or put on you that's causing you baggage tonight, you're carrying a heavy burden, you need to know that this invitation from Jesus is for you. And the translation is this: it's if you feel like a misfit, if you feel messy, if you feel broken, if you feel like an outcast, Jesus says, not go away, but come to me. Walk with me. And he says, I'll give you rest. I'll give you rest, which is good news. And if you're skeptical, if you're not sure that that invitation is legit, then you need to know so were the shepherds. And I know that's true because here's what the angel says next in verse 12. The angel says, you'll recognize him by this sign. Here's your proof, shepherds. Here's your evidence, the angel says. You will find a baby wrapped snugly in strips of cloth, lying in a manger, which is where it gets a little crazy when you understand a few important things. See, the minute the angel said that to the shepherds, they knew exactly where to go. They knew exactly where to find this baby, and I'll tell you why. Remember, they raised these sheep in this field right outside of Bethlehem. Well, these shepherds were called village shepherds, and they lived in homes on the outskirts of town. And so when they're out in the fields and they're taking care of the sheep, when there was a female sheep that's pregnant and about to give birth, they would take that sheep into town and they would take it into a stable, into basically a cave where it was safe. It was protected from predators and from the elements. And they'd wait for that lamb to be born. And when the lamb was born, they'd clean it up and wash it and inspect it. And if it was spotless, then they would wrap it in a swaddling cloth and they'd place it in a manger. They did that so that the lamb wouldn't hurt itself, wouldn't get dirty. And they'd wait there until the lamb could be transported to Jerusalem to be sacrificed to pay for the sins of the people. And so when the angel said to the shepherds, man, here's your proof. You're gonna find this baby wrapped in a swaddling cloth, placed in a manger. They all said, yeah, we know exactly where to go. It's the same cave. It's the same swaddling cloth. It's the same manger where we put the sheep that are gonna be offered in the temple as a sacrifice. We know where to go. We know where to find this baby. But here's the crazier thing, okay? What that was proof to them, and honestly, it's proof to you and me, is this. This wasn't just a baby. See, the sign was on purpose. It was a signal. This wasn't just any baby. This was the Savior who they would find wrapped in a swaddling cloth and placed in a manger, awaiting transportation to Jerusalem, where he'd be one day, years down the road, sacrificed to pay for the sins of all the people. Luke goes on and he says, when the angels had returned to heaven, the shepherds said to each other, let's go to Bethlehem. Let's see this thing that's happened, which the Lord has told us about. And they hurried to the village and found Mary and Joseph, and there was the baby lying in the manger. After seeing him, the shepherds told everyone what had happened and what the angel had said to them about this child. And all who heard the shepherd's story were astonished. And Luke says it was just as the angel had told them. Now, that's pretty cool. And I never knew all that stuff connected until I was kind of researching for this year. But now, let me tell you something else that's kind of neat. This might blow your mind a little bit. You might think this is nerdy, but I have the stage, so you have to listen anyway, okay? Let me take you to Mark, which is another gospel, another account of Jesus' life. And this is what Mark writes about Jesus' sacrifice. Do you remember earlier I told you what time lambs were sacrificed? Twice a day, right? 9 a.m., 3 p.m. This is Mark 15, verse 24. He says, then the soldiers nailed Jesus to the cross. They divided his clothes and threw dice to decide who would get each piece. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. I'll skip ahead to verse 34. Then at 3 o'clock, Jesus called out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then Jesus uttered another loud cry and breathed his last, 9 and 3. Why is this such a big deal? I'll tell you why. It's a big deal because it was evidence that proved to the shepherds, and it's evidence for you and me, that Jesus came to be the once and for all sacrifice to pay for the sins of all people. For all time. To make a way for us, the messy and the ragged and the broken and the overlooked, the outcast, the weary and the heavy burdened, to come to the Father and to be forgiven and to find rest and to healing and to belong in the family. And so I just want to say to you, if you feel like you don't belong, and if you feel like you don't have a place in God's family, and if you feel like you couldn't belong in a place like this, number one, you are welcome in the family of God. Jesus invites you to come to him. And number two, you're welcome here. Yeah, I think this church, I know I'm biased, but this church is a little bit different. We don't turn people away. This is a place where you're welcome to come and sort things out with Jesus. And you know what? For some of us, that takes a really, really, really long time. And it's really painful and it's really messy because we have difficult questions and life is not easy. And some of us are a little messy. But Jesus has a whole lot of patience and a whole lot of grace. And what we want to do is we want to walk with you and help you figure it out, because we're figuring it out too. So you're welcome here, and you're welcome in the family of God. Now we're going to sing a couple more songs by candlelight. It's my favorite part of Christmas Eve. If you're one of our candle lighters, go ahead and start making your way around, and they'll start lighting candles. You can pass that down the row. But as they do that, listen, I want you to reflect on something, okay? I want you to reflect on this. The manger is special because it points to the cross. And the cross is special because it points to the empty tomb, which is not a tomb anymore. There used to be a body in it. It's not there. Now it's just a hole in the ground. It was a borrowed grave, borrowed for 3 days until Jesus came out of it. And it's because of the manger. It's because of Christmas. Like, this is when we celebrate what's going to happen here in a few months when we celebrate Easter. And we talk about how Jesus was a sacrifice for us. He was born to be that sacrifice. That's why it's so special that Jesus, this is a reminder that he was the lamb who was born to be slain for the sins of the people. And the cross and the tomb are a reminder that he is a king who conquered sin and death for us. Now, it all comes down to this, okay? Every single one of us is an innkeeper. You get to decide if there's room for Jesus in your life. Nobody can decide that for you. You get to decide what to do with Jesus. And as you're trying to make sense out of who he is and what he's inviting you to and how much he loves you despite whatever's going on in your life and how much he pursues you and wants you. I gotta tell you, just like the shepherds, okay, because that night they were trying to make sense out of everything that they had experienced in their history and what they had been told, and they're trying to reconcile that with what they were hearing and seeing, hearing from the angels, seeing in the manger, and they're trying to make it all make sense. Maybe that's where you are with God, is you're just trying to make sense out of some of it. I have to tell you that God's word to you would not be, hey, if you haven't figured it out by now, go away. Over and over and over and over and over, his invitation to you is the same as it was 2,000 years ago when he said, come to me, all you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I'll give you rest. The moral of the story is this: Jesus welcomes those that others reject and overlook and turn away. That's what this night is all about. That's why we celebrate. That's why we celebrate the fact that he's a friend of the outcast. And man, let me tell you, what a friend I have. What a friend do you have? What a friend we have in Jesus, who one silent night stepped into our world and changed everything for you and me so that we could belong in the family of God.